I'm Emily Dalton, 34 years old, and by the time that Thanksgiving rolled around, I had already decided this would be my last year trying to belong. The table was glowing with candles and crystal laughter floating through the room like smoke, and yet I felt more like an outsider than a guest. My sister leaned close to whisper something sharp enough to slice through the chatter, and before I knew it, the whole table was laughing. My father chuckled behind his wine glass, my brother smirked, and even my aunt joined in. I smiled politely, pretending I hadn't heard the words that would split my world in two before the night was over. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever been the one who gave everything only to be treated like you were nothing. I grew up in rural Nebraska where work came before comfort, and silence was often mistaken for peace. My parents ran a small construction business, and my brother Mason was always the golden child, the one who would take things further. My sister Rachel was the baby fragile and adored. I was the steady one, the dependable one, the one who stayed behind to help when money got tight. When my grandparents passed, I inherited a stretch of dry, forgotten farmland, the kind of place most people would sell off without a second thought. But to me, it was home-cracked soil, rusted fences and all. In college, I studied agricultural science while everyone else rushed to the city. My friends teased me for choosing dirt over desks, but I loved the feel of the earth giving back after rain. When I returned home, I poured every dollar an hour I had into rebuilding that land. At first, it was just me, a few tools, and a dream that seemed too small to impress anyone. Slowly, the acres began to breathe again, corn swaying under an open sky, the hum of irrigation lines, the quiet rhythm of something real growing under my hands. To my family, though, success didn't count unless it came with a title and an office. Mason worked as a real estate broker for a while and carried himself like a man who'd built an empire. Rachel floated through jobs, often calling when bills were due. Mom and Dad clung to their pride even as their business faltered. I showed up every time they needed help, and somehow my help became expected. When the roof leaked, I fixed it. When the fridge broke, I replaced it. When my mother needed medication insurance wouldn't cover, I quietly paid the pharmacy. Each time they thanked me with a nod or a joke about our little farmer making herself useful. There was a winter when the pipes froze at my parents' house. I drove over at 3 a.m, thawed them, and left before sunrise. The next week at dinner, my father laughed, saying, "Well, at least she's good for plumbing." Everyone laughed along, including me. It was easier to smile than to admit how deep those little cuts went. I told myself they didn't mean it that way, that they were just old-fashioned, that love sometimes came dressed as teasing. But every joke carried the same message no matter how much I did. I'd never measure up. Over the years, my support became their safety net. Mason's layoff turned into 6 months of rent I covered. Rachel's divorce became a year of grocery deliveries and tuition payments for her daughter. When Dad's surgery bills piled up, I maxed out a credit card. No one asked where the money came from, only when the next transfer would arrive. They assumed I had time and cash to spare. After all, I was just a farmer. I told myself it was family duty, that someday they'd see me differently. But they never did. The truth is, I carried their lives the way I carried my fields, tending, repairing, protecting. The only difference was that crops give back. My family just took. They never asked about my long days in the heat or the harvests lost to drought. They only noticed when a check didn't clear fast enough or when a repair took longer than expected. I became the quiet constant, the invisible backbone they mistook for background noise. When Thanksgiving came that year, I wanted it to be peaceful, maybe even kind. I paid for the groceries, the florist, the table settings, and even Aunt Marianne's ride over since she hated driving after dark. The house looked beautiful, too beautiful, like a stage set for a play I didn't belong in. My mother wore pearls, my brother carved the turkey with ceremony, and my sister scrolled through her phone between bites. I sat at the corner smiling, pouring wine, hoping that maybe this year they'd see more than just the helper. But deep down, I already knew. The laughter that filled the room wasn't warmth, it was noise meant to hide something colder. And as I watched my family pass dishes and compliments across a table I'd paid for, I felt a quiet shift under my ribs, the way the ground feels right before a storm. I didn't know it yet, but by the end of that night, every unspoken hurt would take shape. The words that would change everything were already waiting on someone's tongue, sharp as broken glass, ready to draw blood from the only person still holding the family together. The smell of roasted turkey still hung in the air, and the candles had started to burn low by the time Mason stood up with his glass raised. He was a few drinks in, flushed and grinning, his voice louder than the room needed. "To the ones who really keep this family going," he said, eyes glancing toward our parents, then to Rachel. "To those who build legacies, not plant potatoes." His words drew laughter, loud and unrestrained, bouncing off the dining room walls. Rachel leaned toward him, her grin sharp. "You're just a lowly farmer, that's all." She added, her voice smooth and deliberate, like she'd been waiting for the perfect moment to say it. The laughter that followed didn't sound like laughter at all. It sounded like the breaking of something fragile. My father chuckled. My mother covered her mouth like she couldn't help herself, and Aunt Marianne giggled until she coughed. Even Lila hid her face in embarrassment, though I could tell she didn't understand why everyone found it funny. I sat still, holding my glass, my pulse steady in a way I didn't expect. It didn't sting. It simply confirmed what I'd always known. No one at that table saw me as anything more than a convenience. For years I had believed love could be earned through service, through paying bills, patching holes, and showing up whenever things fell apart. And yet here they were, laughing at the person who had kept their lights on, who had made sure their world didn't crumble. The noise of their laughter faded into a dull hum, and in that quiet, something inside me shifted. When it finally died down, I placed my napkin beside my plate, stood up, and pushed my chair back slowly. The scraping sound against the tile made everyone look up. "Where are you going?" Mom asked, her tone light as if nothing had happened. "Dessert's coming out soon." I reached for my purse instead of answering. "Just taking care of something," I said. My phone screen glowed against the candlelight as I scrolled through my banking app. One by one, I opened every account tied to my name. The mortgage autopay, Rachel's tuition transfer, the insurance policy linked to Dad's prescriptions. With a few taps, I canceled each one. It took less than a minute. 5 years of silent support dissolved into digital dust. When I looked up again, no one had noticed. They'd already gone back to their small talk, the easy rhythm of people who never had to think about where comfort came from. I slipped the phone back into my purse and smiled. "You're right," I said, my voice steady, almost calm. "I am just a farmer, which means I know when to stop watering dead soil." The room went silent, like a switch had been flipped. Rachel blinked, unsure if she'd heard me right. Mason frowned, confused. My father's jaw tightened, and Mom's smile faltered into something uncertain. I didn't wait for a response. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair, walked past the untouched pie, and headed for the door. The air outside was cold, the kind of crisp that wakes you from a long sleep. As I stepped off the porch, I could hear my mother calling after me, her voice soft but unsure. I didn't turn around. My boots crunched against the gravel driveway, each step heavier with the weight of realization, but lighter with release. When I reached my truck, I looked back once at the glowing windows of the house my family still gathered inside, unaware that the world they leaned on had just shifted beneath them. The drive home was quiet, except for the hum of the engine and the wind moving across the open fields. The farm lights appeared in the distance, steady and familiar, like a heartbeat I could finally hear again. I parked near the barn, turned off the ignition, and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel. No anger, no tears, just a calm I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the kind of calm that comes after forgiveness. It was the stillness that follows a long, silent storm. That night, I didn't replay the dinner in my head. I didn't wonder what they'd say when the payment stopped or when the next bill came due. I just went about my routine like always, fed the animals, locked the gates, and stood on the porch watching the stars rise over the pasture. The cold air brushed against my face, sharp but clean, and for the first time I didn't feel small. I felt free. The next morning, sunlight crept through the kitchen window as I brewed coffee and opened my laptop. The farm books were tidy, the numbers clear. Everything I'd built had come from my own 2 hands, not from approval or applause. I opened a new document and started listing every recurring expense tied to my family, every check, every online payment, every automatic withdrawal. It wasn't out of spite. It was clarity. The list grew longer than I remembered: mortgage contributions, medical premiums, Rachel's tuition, Lila's school fund, even the Wi-Fi bill my parents never realized I'd been paying. By the time I reached the last entry, the total made me pause. $72,000. That was what I had poured into keeping their comfort alive. I stared at the number, not with bitterness, but with disbelief. It wasn't the money that shocked me, it was how quietly I had given it away. Each transaction had been an attempt to hold a family together that didn't really want to be held. I spent the rest of the day going through every shared account. I closed the joint credit line with Mason, froze the automatic tuition transfers, and sent final notices to disconnect shared streaming and household services. It was methodical, almost mechanical, like harvesting after a long season. I wasn't destroying anything. I was just reclaiming what was mine. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of hay and cold earth. I walked the length of the fence line, the familiar path where the sun always broke first. The fields were bare now, sleeping through winter, but I could still see where the rows had stood proof that something had grown because I cared for it. Maybe that was the lesson I had missed all along, that not everything you water is meant to live. By evening, I was sitting on the porch again, watching the horizon fade into deep gold. The phone buzzed twice on the table beside me, 2 missed calls from Rachel, 1 from Dad. I didn't answer. Instead, I let the calls roll into silence, the same silence they had once given me when I needed kindness. The porch light flickered softly, the air cool and still. I wrapped my hands around the coffee mug and exhaled. Inside the house, everything hummed with its usual rhythm, the steady tick of the clock, the creak of the floorboards, the distant sound of wind through the trees. But underneath that, something new had settled in. It wasn't guilt or grief, it was peace. A quiet understanding that I didn't have to keep proving my worth to people who refused to see it. I looked out at the barn one last time before going inside. The stars were bright above the fields, and the night stretched wide and endless. Tomorrow I'd start the real work, untangling myself completely from their world, line by line, account by account. But for now, I'd just let the quiet stay. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is walk away without a word. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The silence that had settled tonight would not last long. When the bills went unpaid, when the cards failed, when the lights flickered out, they would finally realize what they had lost. But by then, I would already be gone, standing in a different kind of light, one I had made for myself. The weekend after Thanksgiving, I woke up before sunrise like always. The sky was still dark, and the house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a clean break. I poured myself a cup of coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The glow from the screen cut through the dark room as I started listing every expense I had ever taken on for my family. Mortgage payments, medical bills, school fees, even the shared accounts for Wi-Fi and streaming services. It was all there, neatly organized in digital ink. For years, those payments had been automatic, quiet little gestures of loyalty I never questioned. Seeing them written down now was like reading a diary I hadn't meant to keep. There were entries dating back 5 years, small transfers that had seemed harmless at the time, but added up to something enormous. Each one carried a memory: a late-night call from Mason about rent, a tearful text from Rachel saying she'd pay me back soon, a medical invoice Mom forgot to mention until the due date had passed. I kept scrolling until the list ended, and when I totaled the numbers, the results stared back at me: $72,000, given away without a single thank you. I closed the document, exhaled slowly, and began to undo it all, one account at a time. I logged into the bank and removed my name from the joint card I'd opened with Mason. I shut down the tuition autopay I'd set up for Rachel's daughter. I canceled the insurance plan that had quietly covered both my parents for years. Then I froze the emergency savings account that my father still believed was his. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, I had severed every link that tied my money to their comfort. It wasn't anger that drove me. It was exhaustion, the kind that doesn't shout, but finally whispers enough. When I stepped outside to feed the chickens, the frost on the grass shimmered under the first light. The air was sharp against my skin, but for once, The cold didn't bite. It woke me up. The farm hummed with its familiar rhythm, the soft cluck of hens, the creak of the barn door, the slow whir of the irrigation pump coming to life. It grounded me, reminding me that while everything else felt uncertain, this land had never failed me. By Monday, the quiet began to shift. The first text came from Rachel just before 10 in the morning. "Hey, Em, is our prime down weird?" 10 minutes later, another. "Hey, the tuition payment didn't go through. Did the bank mess something up?" I didn't respond. I watched the messages stack up and turned my phone face down on the counter. Around lunchtime, Dad called. I let it ring. Then Mason, then Mom. One by one, their numbers appeared and disappeared on the screen unanswered. The next day brought more confusion. Rachel texted again, short-clipped transactional. "Mortgage site says you're not listed anymore. Everything okay?" Then another. "Need to talk. Urgent." Still, I stayed silent. They'd never asked if I was okay when I was the one sending the money, so I didn't owe them reassurance now. The house felt peaceful in that silence, like a field finally resting after years of overwork. By Wednesday, confusion had turned into panic. The family group chat, which I'd muted months ago, started lighting up. Messages scrolled across the preview bar. Anyone heard from Emily? The Hulu logged out mid-show. Who changed the passwords? Mortgage due next week. What's happening? I scrolled through them once, then cleared the notifications. That afternoon, I drove out to my parents' house. It wasn't a planned visit. It was business. Their home sat on the edge of town, a familiar white-sided house with the same loose shutter I'd fixed twice. I parked by the mailbox and walked up the drive. The door still used the smart lock I'd installed a few years ago. One swipe on my phone and the latch clicked open. The house was empty. I moved through each room quietly deliberate and calm. I disconnected the solar inverter I had installed when the power bills became too high. I reset the smart thermostat and unplugged the Wi-Fi hub. The water filter under the sink had my initials carved into the base, something I'd done without thinking when I installed it, so I unscrewed it and left a small note on the counter. Filtered support removed. Then I opened the linen closet and gathered the emergency lanterns, the solar chargers, and the blankets I had bought each winter without a word. It wasn't revenge. It was a return. When I reached Rachel's apartment later that afternoon, I didn't go inside. I simply opened the app linked to her smart doorbell, the one I'd bought when she was going through her divorce and worried about living alone. I disabled the connection with a single tap, then logged out. Just like that, I disappeared from her digital world. By Thursday, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls, texts, voicemails, some frantic, some cold, all laced with confusion. I didn't answer any of them. That night, while I sat at my desk reviewing the week's farm orders, another message came through from Rachel Mom's freaking out. The insurance isn't covering her meds. "Did you change something?" I read at once, then set the phone aside. There was nothing to explain. I had been carrying their world on my back for years. They just never noticed until I put it down. Friday came with silence, the kind that doesn't soothe, it stings. But this time, it wasn't mine to carry. Somewhere between the canceled payments and the missing conveniences, they had begun to realize the truth. The farmer they mocked had been the one keeping their lives steady. I imagined Mason on the phone with the bank, Rachel scrolling through accounts in disbelief, my father frowning at a bill he didn't know how to pay. I didn't wish them harm. I simply knew it was their turn to face what I had lived with all along the cost of being invisible. That evening, as the sun set over the fields, I walked the rows of soil I had turned myself. The air smelled like rain on metal, earthy and raw. In the distance, the farmhouse lights glowed soft and golden. Everything I needed was right here. I sat on the porch, the phone still buzzing beside me, and watched the sky fade into darkness. Somewhere inside that silence was the sound of something ending. Old habits, old debts, old expectations quietly falling away. I didn't know what would come next, only that I wasn't going back. Because when you spend years keeping others warm, it takes time to remember what your own warmth feels like. The calls would keep coming, I was sure. The confusion would turn to blame soon enough. But as I leaned back and looked out at the land I had built with my own hands, I knew this was where the real story began. The soil was still the night cool and wide, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the weight of anyone else's world pressing against mine. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore. It was honest. And beneath that quiet, something new was starting to grow. The weekend slipped by quietly. I worked the land as usual, repaired a fence post near the pasture, and kept my phone turned face down on the counter. Each sunrise felt lighter somehow, though the silence around me had grown thick. By Monday, that stillness cracked. The first few messages from my family had been short and cautious, but now they came in flurries, calls, texts, voicemails, all asking the same thing. What's going on? Why are the accounts closed? Are you okay? I read them without replying. The words didn't sound like concern. They sounded like panic. By midday, Mason's tone had shifted from confusion to irritation. He left a voicemail saying, "You can't just shut everyone out like this, Em. You're scaring Mom." Then Rachel followed her voice, sharp. "If this is about that stupid dinner, it's childish. We all had a little too much to drink." She didn't realize how clearly her words showed what she really thought, that my worth could only exist if it served her convenience. I turned the volume down and went back to my work. That afternoon, I walked through the orchard behind the barn, the rows bare but steady. I'd planted those trees 5 years earlier, each one a reminder of the patience it takes to see something grow. I touched the bark of the oldest one, tracing its rough surface with my thumb, and wondered when I had stopped expecting my family to grow in return. They'd grown comfortable instead, roots tangled in dependence, and I'd helped them stay that way. Tuesday morning brought something new. My work email pinged just after 8. The subject line read, "Wellness Check-In." It was from HR. The message was polite but uneasy. "Hi, Emily. We received an anonymous note suggesting you may be under emotional distress. We're just checking in to make sure you're doing all right." My chest tightened. The email included a short paragraph phrases like sudden behavioral change and possible family estrangement. I didn't need to guess who sent it. My family hadn't just decided to talk about me, they'd decided to redefine me. I traced the email's metadata out of habit. The sender's IP pointed to a public library terminal in my hometown. There were only a handful of people who'd have reason to use that computer, and all of them shared my last name. It was a small, familiar kind of betrayal, one meant to look like concern from the outside. They weren't reaching out to mend things. They were reaching out to control the story. By evening, my phone was full of voicemails again. Mom's voice trembled between guilt and accusation. "Emily, you're being cruel. Family is forever. Whatever's going on, we can fix it together." Dad's tone was clipped rehearsed. "You've made your point, but this isn't how grown-ups handle problems." Then Mason's message came angry defensive. "You're scaring people. You can't just cut everyone off. You need help." I sat in the quiet afterward, the house humming faintly around me, and realized they had turned my silence into a symptom. Wednesday brought gray skies and steady wind. The farm felt heavier than usual, the air damp and still. Around noon, I saw a familiar truck pull into my drive. It was my father's old Ford, its engine coughing as it idled near the porch. I watched through the window as the doors opened. Dad in his work jacket, Rachel stepping out beside him, and Mom in the back seat, already wiping her eyes with a tissue. They didn't call ahead. They never did. I stood at the sink for a moment, listening to the gravel crunch beneath their shoes as they climbed the porch steps. Then I dried my hands, slipped off my gloves, and opened the front door before they could knock. The look on their faces said they weren't expecting me to meet them that way. Steady, calm, not broken. "You've got 5 minutes," I said quietly. "Use them well." Mom started first voice trembling, but practiced. "Emily, this has gotten out of hand. We're worried about you. You've always been the heart of this family." Her eyes shimmered, waiting for me to melt. I didn't. I just folded my arms. Dad's tone came next, firm, measured. "We don't know what this is about, but we don't turn our backs on each other. Whatever this tantrum is, it's gone far enough." I tilted my head slightly. "Explain something for me then," I said. "Why was I good enough to pay your bills but not good enough for a seat at your table?" The silence that followed was deep enough to hear the wind through the open fields. Rachel crossed her arms, a smirk tugging at her mouth. "You're throwing away your own family over what pride I took." A slow breath, not to calm myself, but to steady the truth I'd kept buried for too long. "It's about every time I fixed something and was told it was my duty. Every dollar I gave that was met with silence. Every time I made your lives easier and you laughed like I didn't matter." My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The words landed heavier that way. Mom started to cry again, the kind of crying that fills the air but doesn't fill the gap. "You're twisting things," she said softly. "We never meant to hurt you." I turned toward her. "You let them talk about me like I was broken, and you said nothing. You let them call me unstable the moment I said no. You call that love?" Dad's eyes hardened, but I saw something flicker behind them, a recognition he didn't want to name. "You've always been dramatic." He muttered the words weaker than they used to sound. I looked at him for a long moment. "No," I said quietly. "You taught me that love meant loyalty, obedience, and silence. But what you really meant was usefulness." Rachel's arms dropped from her chest. Her voice wavered just for a second. "So this is it. You're cutting us off completely." I met her eyes. "I didn't cut you off out of anger. I cut you off because I finally believe I deserve peace." The porch was still. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves and the creak of the old steps beneath their feet. My father shifted as if trying to find something else to say, then offered the line I'd heard my whole life. "We miss you." I shook my head slowly. "You miss the version of me who never asked for anything, who fixed everything without question. You miss the silence, not me." I stepped back toward the door. "Your time's up." They didn't move right away. Mom's eyes pleaded for one last opening, but I had none left to give. I closed the door gently, not in anger, not in triumph, just with finality. Through the window, I watched them walk back to the truck, their shapes blurred against the fading light. When the engine started, I turned away and leaned against the door, the wood cool against my back. For a long while, I stood there listening to the sound of their car fade down the gravel road. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. I could still hear the echo of my own words hanging in the air, not sharp or bitter, just honest. It was the first time I had ever spoken to them without shrinking. That night the stars hung low over the fields. The house was dark except for the lamp by the window. I sat by it, hands resting in my lap, watching the reflection of my own face in the glass. I didn't recognize every part of it, but I knew this much: I wasn't the same woman who had walked into Thanksgiving dinner. In the distance, the wind carried the faint sound of crickets and the rustle of dry grass, the kind of sound that usually meant change was coming. And deep down, I knew the storm hadn't passed yet. My family would not go quietly, but neither would I. After they left my porch that evening, I didn't sleep much. I sat by the window with the lamp still on, staring out at the road until their taillights disappeared. The house was quiet, except for the soft ticking of the clock, and for a long time I just listened to the silence they left behind. By morning, I knew what I had to do. They thought they could twist my choice into weakness, but I wasn't finished yet. I was done being the family's hidden scaffolding. It was time to show, not tell, what that meant. The first step was simple. I opened my laptop and began to gather everything: bank transfers, loan records, insurance statements, text messages. 5 years of quiet proof. I'd kept receipts for every bill I'd covered, every emergency I'd funded, every shared account they'd tied to my name. As I scrolled, the weight of it settled in. The evidence was there in black and white, the kind that couldn't be explained away as just family helping family. When I reached the folder labeled Household Maintenance, I found pictures from the day I installed their solar inverter, notes from the plumbing repairs, and an invoice from the same water filter I'd taken back. It all told the same story, me doing the work, while they smiled for the photo. By the time the sun was up, I had a file that read like a quiet biography of servitude. Around 10, my phone buzzed again. A message from Mason popped up first. "You really need to stop this, Em. Everyone's talking. You're making us look bad." 10 minutes later, Rachel texted, "Mom's crying nonstop. You've gone too far. Be an adult and fix this." Neither one asked how I was. They just wanted the cleanup to continue. I set the phone down and kept typing. By noon, I was done collecting. I sat back, saved everything to a drive, and opened a blank document. The cursor blinked on an empty page. It wasn't rage that filled me, it was clarity. I began typing a statement, plain and factual. I wrote, "For those wondering why I've gone quiet, here's what silence was covering." Then I started attaching the proof, screenshots of group chats where Rachel called me unstable. The email traced to the library, the one sent to my workplace, payment histories showing my name on their accounts, even the pharmacy bills for prescriptions I never took. Each file told the truth they refused to say out loud. When I finished, I gave the post a title that fit the life they'd dismissed lowly, but not silent. I uploaded it to my social page, the one I rarely used except for farm updates. Within minutes, the post began to spread. Friends, neighbors, even old classmates shared it. The comments came fast, words like proud. Finally, I knew something was off. People saw what I'd lived through, and for the first time, the story wasn't theirs to rewrite. By evening, the numbers grew into the hundreds. My inbox filled with messages from people who had known my family for years but never guessed what was really happening behind the polite smiles. Some offered kind words, others just said thank you. My old college professor wrote, "Your strength was never small, Emily." They just pretended not to see it. Then, as if to prove the point, my family began to unravel in real time. Rachel deleted her social media within hours. Mason switched his profile to private. Mom's page vanished altogether. Only Dad's company listing remained, but even that changed by morning. His contact number removed, his business address hidden. They were retreating one by one from the world they had always performed for. I didn't take joy in it, but I did feel something new stillness. The kind that comes after a long storm finally passes. The weight of their narrative no longer pressed against me. The next day, a message came from someone I hadn't expected. My cousin Haley, who had stayed silent during every family argument, wrote, "You didn't destroy anything. Emily, you exposed it." That single line stayed with me longer than any of the others. It wasn't praise, it was recognition. By Friday, I had finished what I started. I uploaded a final folder labeled Harvest Records. Inside were scanned invoices, canceled checks, and a formal document showing that I had legally removed myself from all shared obligations. It wasn't dramatic. It was clean, simple, complete. That night, I sat in the greenhouse trimming the last of the tomato vines. The air smelled of soil and green stems, sharp but comforting. I glanced at my phone once, half expecting another wave of messages. But there was nothing. No calls, no threats, no pleas. Just silence, the same silence they'd once used to dismiss me now returned to them like a mirror. As the sun went down, I realized how much space there was in that quiet. It didn't ache anymore. It breathed. The farm lights glowed soft across the yard, the hum of the generator steady and calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for anyone's approval, apology, or understanding. I was simply here, present in my own life again. When I closed the greenhouse door and walked back toward the house, the air was cool and still. I could see my reflection faintly in the kitchen window. Tired eyes, calloused hands, but a steady expression. The kind you get when you stop asking to be seen and simply stand where you are. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the table, the same one I'd once covered with bills and receipts. Now it held only the soft light of a single candle. I let it flicker for a while before blowing it out. Tomorrow there would still be work to do, plants to tend, orders to fill, but the work would be mine alone. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees, carrying the faint scent of cut hay. It was the sound of peace, not perfection, just quiet continuity. And as I sat there listening, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the pause before something new took root. The world I'd built out of loyalty had crumbled, but what replaced it was honest and whole. I didn't need their validation to know that. All I needed was the steady rhythm of my own breath, the creak of the farmhouse, and the knowledge that when morning came, I'd wake up free. And though I didn't know what my family would do next, I knew how I would meet it with the same steadiness I'd built everything else on. Quiet, firm, and unshakable. The morning after, I posted everything. I woke before dawn. The sky outside was still gray, and the air held that heavy calm that comes before change. I brewed coffee, sat at the table, and scrolled through the messages flooding in overnight. Hundreds of people had seen the post: neighbors, friends, old coworkers. Some offered kindness. Others shared stories that sounded too familiar. But none of the names that mattered most appeared in the list. Not one from my family. For 2 days I heard nothing. No calls, no knocks at the door, not even a text from Rachel. The quiet was strange, almost heavy with waiting. Then on the third morning, a message came from Haley. "They're saying you've lost your mind, Em. Mom told me they're calling it a breakdown. Thought you should know." I stared at the screen for a long time, then typed a short reply. "Thank you." I shouldn't have been surprised. When the truth doesn't fit someone's story, they rewrite the story. And my family had always been skilled storytellers, especially when it came to protecting their image. By afternoon, a few neighbors mentioned seeing my mother at the market, red-eyed and dramatic, talking about how worried she was for me. My father, meanwhile, had posted a short message on his company page: "Family is everything, even when they forget it." That evening, the first real confrontation came not from them directly, but from their circle. A message from one of Dad's old friends landed in my inbox. "You've hurt good people, Emily. Airing private matters never ends well." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The truth had already done what it was supposed to: show the cracks they'd worked so hard to hide. Still, the smear campaign grew louder over the next few days. Anonymous numbers left voicemails. Short messages, all echoing the same line: "You need help." I kept each one saved, every text, and added them to the same folder as my records. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about protection. I'd learned enough to know that when someone's control slips, they get desperate. Late Thursday night, I sat by the greenhouse window, watching the wind whip through the dry grass. The reflection of my face against the glass looked calmer than I felt. That's when I saw the headlights turning down my road again. I didn't move at first. The truck was familiar, Dad's Ford. It rolled to a stop near the porch headlights, cutting through the dark. I turned off the lamp and waited. After a minute, there was a knock. 3 times. Firm, practiced. When I opened the door, my father was standing there, hat in hand, eyes cold. Behind him stood Rachel, arms crossed, and Mom already crying before a word was spoken. The night air smelled of dust and gasoline. I held the door halfway open. "It's late," I said quietly. "This can wait." Dad shook his head. "No, this ends tonight." His voice carried that tone he used when I was a child, the one that made everything sound like an order. Rachel stepped forward. "You humiliated us, Emily. Do you understand that I leaned against the doorframe?" I told the truth. "You twisted it," she snapped. "You made us look like monsters." I didn't respond right away. The porch light flickered above us, casting uneven shadows across their faces. Mom's hands trembled as she clutched a folded tissue. "Please, sweetheart," she said softly. "You're angry, I get it, but this is cruel. We're still your family." I looked at her for a long moment. "You keep saying that like it excuses everything." Dad's jaw tightened. "What do you want, Emily?" "An apology." "Fine. I'm sorry you felt unappreciated. But this public nonsense stops now." Something in his tone broke the still air between us. It wasn't regret. It was command. The same old rhythm wrapped in softer words. I stepped closer, meeting his eyes. "It's not nonsense, Dad. It's my life, and I'm done hiding it for you." Rachel scoffed. "You think people respect you now? They're laughing at you, calling you unstable." I nodded once. "Maybe, but they're finally saying my name." The silence that followed felt like a held breath. Mom reached for me, but I stepped back. "You can't just walk away from your own blood," she whispered. "I didn't walk away," I said. "You pushed." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Dad took a step forward, his voice low. "Enough. You've made your point. Take the post down. Now." I shook my head. "No." He exhaled sharply, the sound halfway between anger and disbelief. Rachel muttered something under her breath, then turned toward the truck. Mom lingered a moment longer, her eyes searching mine like she could find the daughter she used to control. "We miss you," she said. I looked past her at the empty field beyond the road. "You miss the silence, Mom. Not me." When the truck finally pulled away, I stood on the porch until the taillights disappeared behind the curve. The air felt lighter, the kind that comes after a storm breaks, but before the calm settles. I walked back inside, locked the door, and leaned against it. My hands were steady. I wasn't shaking this time. That night, I sat down at my desk and opened the same folder that held all my proof. I added one final entry, a video clip from the doorbell camera. Their visit, their words, their attempts to rewrite the truth right on my porch. It wasn't for revenge, it was record-keeping. The story wasn't just mine anymore. It was documented. The next morning, I uploaded the footage along with a quiet caption. When the truth makes people uncomfortable, they call it betrayal. I didn't tag anyone. I didn't name them. I just let it exist. By noon, the video had spread farther than the first post. Comments poured in, not from strangers this time, but from people who'd once believed my family's version of events. By sunset, the shift had begun. A few family friends unfollowed my parents' accounts. One of Dad's old business partners left a public comment on the video. Integrity means owning what we do in the dark, not just what we show in the light. Mason tried to fight back online, but it only drew more attention to the proof. Every word I had posted was verified, every receipt traceable. By the end of the week, my phone stopped buzzing. No more anonymous messages, no new rumors, just quiet. The kind that doesn't ask for anything, the kind that means the storm is running out of fuel. That night, I walked out to the field, the moon bright over the horizon. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. I stood there for a long time, letting the silence stretch around me. The damage was done, but so was the pretending. My family had spent years calling me the quiet one. Now my silence finally had meaning, and though I didn't know what would come next, I knew this much: nothing they said could bury the truth again. Because once you've learned how to speak without apology, there's no going back to whispering. The following week was quieter than I expected. No new messages, no surprise visits, no late-night calls. The noise had finally faded, replaced by a kind of stillness that didn't ask for my attention. The posts I had shared were still spreading, but I stopped checking the numbers. I didn't need to. The truth was moving on its own. One morning, while sorting seed orders at the kitchen table, I noticed an email from a name I hadn't seen in years. Laura Jenkins, my old high school English teacher. She wrote, "I read your story, Emily. I always knew you had a quiet strength in you. Thank you for showing it to the world." That line made me pause. It wasn't sympathy, it was recognition. I saved the message before returning to work, my chest lighter than it had been in weeks. By midweek, word reached me through Haley that my family had gone silent online. Mom deleted her accounts entirely. Dad set his business page to private, and Rachel disappeared without a trace. Mason, who had tried arguing with strangers in the comments, had stopped posting altogether. It wasn't triumph, I felt it was relief. The performance was over. That evening, I sat on the porch watching the last light stretch over the fields. The air carried that clean scent of early spring, the kind that makes the soil smell alive again. The farm was quiet. The only sound, the faint hum of insects near the fence. For once, silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like room to breathe. 2 days later, I received a small stack of envelopes in the mail letters without return addresses. Each one had the same looping handwriting. I didn't need to open them to know they were from Mom. I placed them in the drawer beside the stove and left them there. Whatever they contained, it could wait. That night, I uploaded one final post. It wasn't long or dramatic, just a note saying, "Closure doesn't always come with an apology." I attached a picture of the farm at sunset, the rows of soil freshly turned, the sky painted orange and gold. It was a quiet image, but it said everything that needed saying. After that, I stepped away from the internet altogether. My world had been digital chaos for too long. I turned off notifications, let my phone rest on the counter, and walked outside into the steady rhythm of real life again. Over the next week, neighbors began stopping by. Some came to buy produce, others just to talk. One of them, Mrs. Bailey from down the road, brought a basket of apples and said softly, "You did what most of us are too afraid to do, honey." I thanked her, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to explain or justify. In town, people greeted me differently, not with pity or gossip, but with respect, the kind that comes quietly without words. I didn't need anyone's approval, but it felt good to be seen for something other than what I could provide. One afternoon, as I restocked crates at the farmer's market, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. She introduced herself as Claire, a nurse who'd recently moved from Omaha. "I read your post," she said. "It reminded me of when I had to walk away from my own family. I thought I was the only one." Her eyes held the same exhaustion I used to see in my own mirror. We talked for a while, and by the time she left, she'd invited me to join a local co-op group she was starting. I said yes. Back at the farm that evening, I looked out over the fields, stretching into the horizon. The land was quiet, but not empty. Each row of turned earth felt like a promise. I was rebuilding not the way I had before, but from a different foundation. No more invisible labor, no more unspoken debts. Just the slow, honest work of tending something that gives back. That weekend, I drove into town to buy new supplies. It had been months since I'd allowed myself anything outside necessities. I picked up fresh paint for the barn, new gloves, and a small packet of sunflower seeds, the kind my grandmother once planted along the fence line. When I got home, I spent the afternoon restoring the barn walls. Each stroke of paint felt like a small act of reclamation, covering years of weather and neglect. The next morning, I planted the sunflower seeds in a straight line by the eastern field. The soil was cool beneath my palms, the sky wide and forgiving. I pressed each seed gently into the earth and whispered, "Grow strong." It wasn't prayer exactly, more of a quiet request. As the days passed, the farm began to take on a different kind of life. The animals seemed calmer, the air lighter. I started seeing familiar faces at the market again, not just as customers, but as friends. Haley visited one weekend, bringing her kids to help pick apples. Watching them run between the trees made me realize how long it had been since laughter filled this place. That evening after they left, I found myself standing by the porch steps, watching the sky shift into dusk. The horizon was streaked with gold, the first hints of my new sunflower row just beginning to peek through the soil. I thought of all the years I'd spent giving everything I had to people who never noticed the cost. It struck me how different this silence felt now, no longer lonely, but peaceful. A few days later, I received one last message from Rachel. It wasn't an apology, not really. Just a short line that read, "We didn't realize how much you did. I hope you're okay." I stared at it for a while before replying, "I am. I hope someday you are too." I didn't expect a response, and none came. That night, I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where I used to sort bills and family receipts. The candle flickered softly beside me, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind rustled the new shoots by the fence. There was something comforting in the sound, a reminder that even after being stripped bare, the earth knows how to begin again. When I finally went to bed, the farmhouse was still and warm. The kind of quiet that once made me ache now felt like peace. I didn't know what the next season would bring, but I knew this much: I had finally planted something that belonged only to me. And as I drifted to sleep, I thought of the sunflowers waiting beneath the soil, and how when they bloomed, the first thing they would see was light. Summer came early that year, the kind where mornings already smelled like heat and earth before the sun even rose. The farm was alive again. The rows of crops stretched green and full across the fields, and by the fence the sunflowers I'd planted had grown tall enough to brush against my shoulder. Every morning I walked their line, running my fingers along the leaves, feeling the strength of something that had taken root in silence and found its way toward light. I hadn't spoken to my family since Rachel's last message. It had been months now, and the distance no longer felt like an open wound. It felt healed, stitched by time, by truth, and by the quiet work of living. Sometimes I still thought about them when I passed familiar places in town. The diner where Dad used to take us after church. The grocery store Mom loved for its samples. But the ache that used to follow those memories had softened. Some love I'd learned doesn't need to be revisited to be respected. It can simply rest where it belongs in the past. The farm drew people back into my life in ways I hadn't expected. One morning, a group from the local school came by for a tour. The teacher, a woman named Linda, told me they were studying sustainable agriculture. As I showed the children the greenhouse and the irrigation system, I noticed a small girl walking behind the group, touching everything like it was magic. She reminded me of Lila. When the girl asked, "Do you ever get tired of growing things?" I smiled and said, "No, because when you plant something, you're giving the earth a reason to keep going." The teacher smiled too, and I realized it was the first time in years I'd said something that felt entirely like mine. By mid-July, the first sunflowers bloomed tall gold and facing east. I'd timed the planting so they'd open just before harvest, a quiet reward at the end of a long season. The morning they did, I stood in the field as the sun came up, the light spilling over everything I'd built. It wasn't just a farm anymore. It was proof that peace could grow from ruin if you gave it space. A few days later, I found a letter in the mailbox without a return name. Inside was a single photograph Rachel and Lila at the park. Lila was holding a small sunflower. On the back in Rachel's handwriting were 5 words, "She wanted you to have this." I traced the picture's edge with my thumb, then set it on the mantel beside the window. I didn't write back, but I didn't throw it away either. Some gestures didn't need responses to be understood. That night, I walked outside just before dark. The air was warm, the horizon still holding a line of soft pink light. The farm was quiet, except for the rustle of wind through the tall grass and the hum of crickets hidden in the rows. I looked out across everything I had built, the fences, the crops, the open space that had once felt like loneliness, but now felt like home. I thought about the version of myself who had sat at that Thanksgiving table months ago, smiling through their laughter, believing that love was something I had to earn. I wished I could tell her that she was already enough, that sometimes peace doesn't come from fixing others, but from finally choosing yourself. When I turned to go inside, the farmhouse windows glowed warm against the dark. The porch light flickered softly, the same one Dad and I installed years ago. For a moment I stood there, grateful not for the pain that came before, but for the clarity it left behind, the kind that only arrives after everything false has fallen away. Inside, I poured a cup of tea and sat by the window. The photograph on the mantel caught a sliver of light from the moon, and I smiled. I didn't know if forgiveness would ever be spoken between us, but I'd made peace with that too. Some chapters don't close with words, they end quietly in understanding. As I looked out at the sunflower field, their faces turned toward the night, I realized something simple but true. Growth doesn't always come with applause or approval. Sometimes it comes in silence, in steady steps, in the gentle act of choosing yourself again and again. I took one last sip of tea and whispered softly to the quiet room, "I'm home." Before I end this story, I want to ask you something. If you've ever had to walk away to protect your peace or rebuild yourself after being unseen, I hope you know you're not alone. And if this story spoke to you, take a moment to share it or leave a thought below. Someone out there might need the reminder that even after everything falls apart, it's still possible to bloom.